afternoon, all, and welcome to today's lecture 4 for ecological principles and concepts. So, what we'll be looking at is what are the definitions of concepts and principles. In concepts, we will be looking at 7 different concepts and 5 management concepts. And when we're looking at ecological principles, you're going to be looking at 6 different principles. When we are going through this work, please bear in mind that a lot of these lectures are related to a lot of the lectures that you have learned, say, in marine invertebrates, in lecture 1 of this course, and the fact that there are 16 of you guys working on different ecosystems. So I want you to, while we're going through these concepts and management concepts and principles, I want you to bear in mind how are all of these concepts and principles applied to the ecosystems that you guys are working on. All right. So obviously the first aspect of our lecture is to understand what is concepts and what is principles. Concept is the general understanding of facts about an ecosystem and ecosystem management. So your general understanding, of course, is evidence-based. Whatever is present in the environment, those are your facts. So it is divided into 2 parts. One is looking into the concepts, which I've mentioned there are 7, and the management concepts, which are 5. So ecosystem concepts provide a foundation for developing ecological principles. Your concepts, you may have heard of it, but didn't realize that these were important concepts. And without these concepts, you cannot provide a framework for ecological principles. And when it comes to ecosystem management concepts, it is the tools that can be applied to support some of the ecosystem concepts and to help run the applications that will relate to planning for ecological principles. So bear in mind, the concepts is basically the foundation for principles, okay? But in order to have the concepts, you have to understand the whole ecosystem, and that is why you have this variety of concepts and, of course, the tools for management. Now we're coming to principles. So the principle is the assumption about the ecosystem. Technically, it's not an assumption because, as how I've mentioned before in my first lab, everything is evidence-based. Science is evidence-based. So with the availability of this evidence, it provides an understanding of what you have. So I would say it's a basic understanding about the ecosystems and how they function that are formed by the ecological concepts. So principles uses ecological concepts to the best of their known evidence to draw key conclusions that can guide human applications aimed at conserving biodiversity. So ultimately, principles is the overall bigger picture that helps look into conserving biodiversity. How it's going to be implemented is going to be through these toolkits and this of the different tools for management, and the management will go back to understanding concepts. So you notice that how there is a step-by-step process with understanding concepts and principles. So now if you look into ecological concepts, I've mentioned there are 7. So these are the 7 that we'll be looking on into detail. You're probably familiar with some. We learned number 1 in lecture 1. You have learned native species and keystone. But just so you know, keystone is not just keystone species, there are a few others. And you may be familiar with some of them. There's others like disturbances, but we'll look into it in a little bit more detail. And then you have the ecosystem management concepts, which looks into having to manage the sets of skills or tools to help manage these different concepts. So it looks into cause and find approach, risk in an inherent aspect of decision making, adaptive management, ecosystem-based management, and also protected area. So both those ecological concepts and ecological management concepts helps provide a framework or broad aspect for ecological principles. It looks very straightforward, but I will discuss in detail with you regarding the 6 and which concepts applies to all of these different 6 principles. I do have to notify you that because this is going to be quite a tedious lecture, with a lot of explanations. So I will divide this into 3 parts. The first part will be the ecological concepts. The second part will be ecological management concepts. And the last part will be into talking about the principles. So do bear with me and let's gear up and get started. So the first part, ecological concept. So you have learned this in your lecture 1, which looks at the levels of biological organization. So it looks into the gene level, right up to the organism or the species in reference, and then the population, community, and ecosystem. However, I want you to bear in mind that it seems like a very straightforward concept. But when you're dealing with different ecosystems, example, a very small scale study like what we did in Kerja Lapangan, okay? So remember like how when we're looking at the rocky shore ecosystems, you obviously have very different organisms in that area in comparison to sandy shore ecosystem, or the fact that you were working on the open ocean when you went on the big boat to do your plankton sampling. And then also when you did your benthic organisms, was a different set of organisms that you guys collected and sorted out, didn't you? So that is why I want you to understand that, yes, you're going to find different species, but you also have, when you're looking at levels of biological organizations, you have to understand not just the trophic level or the food chain, but its role of each organisms and its relationship with one another to pool all of these ecosystems, to pool a whole ecosystem together. So now the second concept is looking into native species. So obviously, I've divided you into 16 groups, and that is for a reason. Because while you're supposed, other than having to do your presentation and you feel it's so tedious to do all this homework, but when you're doing this, I want you to be thinking about the things you're working on. So when looking into native species, for some of you who are working on the open ocean, or some of you working on the polar region, what are the native species found on the polar region? So like looking at this picture, of course, you will have the penguins, you have the walruses, okay, you have certain birds which are present, so. But are they migratory species or are they actually native species? And how about the krill? Well, which is it more predominant? Is it more in the polar region or the open ocean? So these are things you really have to think about. Yes, they overlap, they're interrelated, but what species is present in that particular, or technically endemic? And then we have now the non-native species or the alien species, where the species is moved into an ecosystem. And this is usually because of the results of humans. Very rarely does it actually move on its own terms or on its own whims and fancies, say you. Okay, so it is a result of human intervention, whether directly or indirectly. So when I mean by indirectly, it's sometimes say, example, remember in our invertebrate class, I talked about ballast water. So sometimes when you take ballast water in, you have all these different plankton. And then when you go to the destination where initially some of these planktons were not found there, they were introduced. And then because you don't have any predatory species there, they become dominant and then they affect other native species. Okay. So again, this is an indirect one. But a direct one is, say, example like, okay, this is a freshwater example. Like we have the peacock bass, which was used for aesthetic reasons. And of course, for fishing purposes, it's a fish sports game here. So it's intentionally introduced for that, but without the locals realizing that it actually has an effect on the native species here. Okay. So that is intentional. So going back to this introduction, is moving into an ecosystem as a result of humans, indirect or direct, having moved into at the same point or having removed a natural barrier. And so an example here is the Scotch broom or brown bullhead, which are introduced species that are not native actually in the British Columbia, and they have invaded some of the local ecosystems. Now, notice how I mentioned the word introduced, okay? So the thing is, some species can be introduced. However, it may not necessarily harm the native species there, okay? However, when it starts to actually cause some form of damage towards other native species in an ecosystem, it becomes an invasive alien species. So an invasive species I've covered this in our vertebrate class, but let's go through again. So they have the potential to displace native species, example like the peacock does that I mentioned about. And then threaten ecosystems or species with an economic or environmental harm. And it can be particularly damaging since they are not subject to any natural predators. Why is this though? Because sometimes when the introduced species, but if you now look at it in the trophic level, there is no apex predator and they naturally become an apex predator, and that's why there's no other species to control those numbers, and therefore it has an effect on other native species. And then coincidentally, diseases can keep other native population species in check. But sometimes if it goes out of hand, it becomes a big problem. And then some invasive species can cause a fundamental change in the ecosystem composition, structure, and the function, as I've mentioned before. So another example is the spread of the Eurasian water milfoil in freshwater ecosystem in the British Columbia. Now, this was actually introduced by boat trailers. Probably it stuck to the trailers, and then, of course, when they were cleaning up, they would usually throw it into the lake without realizing that it can be prolific. So it has clogged the gravel spawning beds used by salmon. So now the thing with salmon is that, if you're not made aware, the smelt or the juvenile stage of the salmon, they are usually from the marine waters. So they will actually migrate up to freshwater. The adults will migrate up to the freshwater lake, waterfalls and lakes, in order to be able to breed again. Now the thing is that the gravel spawning grounds is such that the eggs will actually latch on into these little small gravels, so that when it comes big, it actually can return back to marine waters. But the thing is now with this water milfoil is that since it has covered the whole seabed, it sort of clogs the seabed, and hence it also sort of suffocates and also prevents the eggs from actually maturing and becoming bigger. And also because it's formed like a bloom as such on the picture on your right here, it has resulted in an increase in the amount of phosphorus in some of these lakes. Okay, now we're moving into the third concept, which is keystone species. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. So keystone species have an effect on the biological communities that are disproportionate to their abundance and biomass. Okay, interestingly, keystone species are not necessarily the most common or most abundant species. However, they actually do play a very vital role in actually balancing the numbers of other species around them. So now the loss of the keystone species results in a broader community or ecosystem level effects. And keystone species actually interacts with other species. The interaction can actually be through predation, or symbiotic dependencies. Examples like plant-pollinator relationships or ecosystem modifications like cavity nesters or beaver impoundment. So when beavers actually found like a mound nearby rivers, okay, so at the riverbank, so it actually helps provide a ecosystem for other fishes and other invertebrates. If you look at the marine example here, remember I taught you guys about this Pocesta starfish in our lab 2 and lab 1. So what happens here is that the Pocesta is considered the keystone species here, where in its presence, there are 15 other species diverse species living within the ecosystem. And the Pocesta actually regulates the mussel community within the ecosystem. However, the moment the keystone species is out, the mussel starts to invade and actually drop the numbers of other species, okay? In terms of how these numbers are dropped, in terms of there is a competition in terms of the food resources. So perhaps other invertebrates are unable to compete because of the prolific number of mussels. And that's why the numbers of species are reduced. So how the term keystone came about is that if you look at an arch exactly like it is, the middle part or the top part of that arch is where, example, the sea star is right now. It's considered the keystone, which actually forms a balance It's one little stone there, but it actually forms a balance. So the moment that keystone is removed, the whole arch will actually collapse. And that's how the term keystone came about. So another example for those working on kelp forests is where the sea otter is the keystone species here. So it feeds on sea urchins, and in turn the sea urchins actually feed on the kelp. So actually the sea otters, of course, by limiting the number of sea urchins, there's enough kelp to make it into a forest. And of course, the kelp actually provides a habitat for other fish and invertebrates. But then if you get rid of the sea otters, for example, hunting, then you have a prolific number of sea urchins. Sea urchins will eat the kelp will disappear, and by removing the kelp, you're removing the forest. So, another thing with keystone is you're familiar with species, but do you know that there is keystone ecosystems? So with the keystone ecosystems, it's particularly important because it provides a habitat for a large portion of critical elements. So example here is a thick riparian vegetation, which is found in Pisuerga River in Spain. And of course, you have the Matol River in estuary. Now, I just want you to think about this in terms of the marine aspect, okay? Riparian in somewhat ways is brackish water. But how about other keystone species? Say, example, corals. Corals, they are species and animal itself, but they form the whole habitat, the whole ecosystem. So that is why it's very important to, make MAPs, marine protected areas. Or how about the fact of mangrove forests, for that matter, because it's a different sense of biodiversity that you get from mangrove forest. Even kelp, for the matter, the fact that if you remove kelp, you technically remove the whole ecosystem. So that's what keystone ecosystems are. Now, there's also a thing called keystone processes, where it's the fundamentals to maintaining the ecosystem. Now, you may have seen forest fires. Forest fires in its natural condition. When I mean by natural, in the sense that it happens seasonally according to its own time, not human intervention where we actually throw a cigarette butt and then it catches on fire and boom, that becomes a problem. But in a natural condition where it's a seasonal thing, this is actually okay to happen. Volcanoes actually in Hawaii happening so often not, is actually to give rise for new plants and vegetations also to grow. So it's not all bad things are entirely bad. It has some good out of it. And pollination also is considered a keystone process, because without pollinations, of course, you can't flower, and then bees can't make their honey. So, of course, it's a win-win situation. So that is called a keystone process. Can you think of any keystone processes in the marine aspect? Probably in terms of upwelling, So it's very much applicable too. Now, coming to the fourth concept, which is viability, or looking into a certain threshold, a certain resistance, okay? So the viability for species or population, okay, is the probability, the kebarangkalian of survival of a population or a species in the face of ecological processes such as disturbances. So disturbances can come in two forms, either humans or natural disturbances, all right? But more often not, what really pushes that threshold or the limit is human intervention, all right? Now, the thing is, if we push it to an extent, say that it actually, the habitat for that matter, or the species reaches an extinction threshold, it's meaning to say it's reached its extinction limit, yeah? The population species will decline and eventually disappear. So it has a bit of a dynamo effect, where if you have the habitat loss, and then of course, the species will definitely eventually disappear. So now, although extinction is very normal, yes, extinction in normal conditions, meaning it actually extincts in its own time, like how all of those dinosaurs and all got extinct was without our intervention at all. It's well and fine. So, but if we are pushing the limits of extinction, that becomes abnormal. So although extinction is normal in natural ecosystems, present rates of extinctions have been accelerated by human activities. So extinction does occur, but it's like humans are considered the catalyst. Kita perangsang to actually sort of make things worse in a way. so to speak. So species level details about, so in order to prevent this from happening, we need to gather a lot of species level details. You know how I always emphasize about species, and you go like, why do we have to? Because other than creating that identity, we need to understand the biology of the species. So species level details about the movement, behavior, life history. It demonstrates the threshold responses vary by species and can be difficult to detect. Example, like we do know, when evaluating the anthropogenic threats to endangered killer whales, of course, with killer whales in comparison to certain algae and whatnot, it's very different life cycle. Okay, you're talking about one uni-organism and multi-organism. So I mean, there's so many things to look into. So every species is going to be treated very differently. So now the way to assess viability thresholds is actually forming a plot graph such. So in some ways, the thing is we have to look at the current threats that's facing it. So obviously this has to be collected data over a few tens or even hundreds of years of compiled metadata. And from that data, we can actually see a current threat trend. So if one were to extrapolate and sort of form a model that can assess, okay, what if we totally remove anthropogenic threats? This is what the numbers can look like, okay? If we continue to increase the number of anthropogenic interventions, however, one at a low increase, obviously the graph in terms of the population size will be worse. And if there's a high increase, it's going way lower at a more exponential rate, all right? So in that sense, it's having to create a form of predictions of where we are now. So remember how sometimes we have this idea of by 2050, microplastics will actually fill the oceans more than fishes. It's forming this kind of predictions that you see where we are escalating to, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And then when it comes to the minimum viable population, it's the smallest isolated population having a reasonable chance of surviving over time. Okay, so you're looking at an isolated population, a very small population, but it's quite critical, and you're looking at how they are able to survive over time, despite the foreseeable effects of demographics, environmental, and genetic events on natural disturbances. So basically what it looks into is the reproduction and the survival of the individual. If it's found to decrease, of course, there'll be a continuing decline in the population numbers. It's, again, a dynamo effect. Now looking at ecological resilience, with the resilience or how you're able to survive, okay? So it is the capacity of an ecosystem to cope with the disturbance. So now it's like such, viability is how much you're able to handle the pressure. But in this case, the resilience looks at bouncing back, okay? How it returns to a stable state. So notice how this one is viability, okay? Again, viability looks at when you're pushed to a certain threshold. Now, this one goes a step further into looking how does it return to a stable state. That is ecological resilience. So it measures among the stress or disruption required to transform a system that is maintained by one set of structures and processes to a different set of structures and functions. So you're going to look into different processes and also functionality of the work. So one of the best places that you all can relate to is Bidong Island itself. So why I wanted to show this picture is that when you went to the island, it was evergreen, it was like full of trees. But back then in 1970, it was used as a settlement for the Vietnamese, as you would know, to an extent that it was almost balding, if you can see. You know, it was heavily populated that you might think there is no sense of recovery. But back in the 1980s, when it was totally back with us from Malaysia, and it was used as a research station, which means there's less stress on the ecosystem, it was quite amazing to see how it actually got back to its kind of its original state. Yes, there are some particular losses in terms of whatever naturally occurring organisms, say on the island itself, may not be able to survive. But in terms of the surrounding waters, fishes were able to come back because they're not heavily exploited. So that's ecological resilience. So it's a resilient ecosystem that can better withstand shocks and rebuild itself without collapsing into a different state. Okay, so in this sense, the island was such that it can recover because it has a different resilience of bouncing back into recovery. But not all ecosystems actually have that capacity, because some, once you're lost, it's gone for good. So you have to treat every ecosystem differently, because remember I talked about the first concept, the different levels of organizations, biological organization. Every organism plays its part into making an ecosystem run well. So this is where I'm coming to with the resilience. So resilience, you're looking into two aspects of how it can bounce back to recovery. One is looking into functional diversity and the other is looking to response diversity. Now with functional diversity is the number of function of different groups of species and consists of two aspects. One, it's the level of biological organization, where it affects the influence of a function within a scale, and it aggregates the influence across scales. So in other words, how does each organism, as an individual or a population or a community, how does it play its role in bouncing back, creating resilience for the ecosystem itself? Now, with response diversity is the diversity of responses to environmental change among species. So now it's how the role is, the function is. But responses is how does each group or levels of species respond to ever-moving changes. So example, like in this case, the fact that farmers want to grow an agricultural land, and of course for cattle. So these are not naturally occurring, okay? But by introducing a lot of goats, a lot of cattle, say in this ecosystem, is there a form of balance? Can it cope with just this number of cattle, or if it's more, is it going to actually wipe off the whole ecosystem? Because again, what makes up the ecosystem? Say example in this case is the grasses, okay? So or certain trees. So if it's going to feed off of the resources, how is the ecosystem going to respond towards that influence? Okay, so this is what the whole definition means, where the diversity of responses to environmental changes among species, contributing to the same ecological function, and provides adaptive capacity given complex systems, uncertainty, and human influence. So a very simple example, again, I'm not giving marine, because I want you to critically think how is it applicable to your ecosystem. So with the example of the rangeland, okay, when you're looking to functional diversity, so how we can improve functional diversity of each role of organisms within the rangeland is one, to increase the productivity of a plant community as a whole. So one of the most important, the key, I would say the keystone species that plays a part in rangeland, of course, is the plant itself, different plant communities that makes it good. So if you were to increase that community as a whole, of course, you're going to have a form of good diversity, functional diversity. But it's to an extent that if you don't increase the productivity, it'll be very poor, as such on the picture here on the far left. And then it's, of course, bringing together the species that take water from different depths. Okay, so what makes this rangeland is important is that it's able to collect water, all right? So it requires a certain kind of community of plants to actually help bring these water together. So again, that helps into forming a good functional diversity. And of course, the amount of abiotic factors, which is the amount of carbon and nutrients, is highly crucial for a rangeland. If you're talking about response diversity, okay, so it's looking into enabling a community to keep performing the same way in the faces of stresses. So what sort of stress will a rangeland form, okay? So looking at disturbances, example, if there is fires, okay, if either seasonal fires, so this is the natural disturbance I'm talking about, or grazing or drought. Okay, grazing is a human intervention. If, example, you bring cattle and then it grazes, how extensive is the damage of grazing? And then drought, of course, it's seasonal, but then again, this drought sometimes is in a way a human intervention also, because we have indirectly affected climate change, and that has prolonged drought as well. So can it recover in those form of stresses? How are all of those communities coming together to ensure it's able to respond well? Okay, so remember how I mentioned about disturbances? So of course, we also have to be able to identify sort of disturbances we are facing. So they are naturally occurring disturbances and also human induced. Okay. So with this picture, of course, it's very straightforward. Oil spills and plastics are very much human induced. With volcanoes, of course, it's very much naturally occurring. With tornadoes and typhoons and hurricanes, it's a little bit tricky because, yes, that has happened even without human intervention. However, we have some form of responsibility towards the intensity and the prolonged, unpredictable times these hurricanes and what do occur, because we have influenced climate change indirectly, and of course, climate change have of course influenced the intensity in the prolonged and unpredictable times hurricanes, typhoons, and all actually do occur. And the last part of our general ecological concept is connectivity and fragmentation. So connectivity and fragmentation is the degree to which an ecosystem structure or the ecosystem itself is able to facilitate, is able to help, is able to aid or impede, block, form obstacles of the movement of organisms between resource patches. Okay. Now the thing with connectivity is connectivity allows individual organisms to move. Okay, just imagine like a migration of wildebeest, for example, to move in response to changing conditions, such as seasonal cycles or climate change. If you're talking about a marine example, probably you can refer to the migratory cetaceans in the Pacific. But then if there's a loss of connectivity, this results in fragmentation. Okay, so what constitutes connectivity is scale dependent and varies for each species depending on its habitat requirements, sensitivity to disturbances, and vulnerability to human-caused mortality. Okay, in this example here, this is a river system, which at least to the best of my understanding, there is no particular human intervention here. So of course, you're going to have marine waters, fresh water moving into marine waters, okay? And what's happening here is that, in a way, this is is a very subtle barrier, because of course you have your marine waters, and then you have the mixture of freshwater and marine, and of course there you have solely freshwater. Just this differences in terms of the physical parameters. That means you're looking at just your salinity is going to be different. The form of nutrients that's available is going to be different. This and although it looks connected, but there's also some sense of fragmentation. So because this is marine nutrients coming through, so the type of organisms that you're going to get are going to be very different. So you have a western pond turtle, you have aquatic garter snakes, and you have the salmonoids. So they are very much going to be very much found in these waters. But the thing with salmonids is they're quite adaptive, okay? So that's why they can move more towards freshwater a bit. So that's why you find salmonids right up to this part, even when it's already beginning to branch into terrestrial aquatic reciprocal subsidies. But you don't find any more of the garter snakes and the water pond turtle towards the terrestrial side, okay? And then when you're coming more towards this and before it branches out, you start getting yellow-legged frogs and coastal giant salamanders. But when it's coming more towards the aquatic sites, you don't see any more of the the foot-hid yellow-legged frog, but you're beginning to see more the tail frog. Interestingly, the coastal giant salamander can actually adapt to freshwater, but the salamander only stops at the coastal side. But then you have the southern torrent salamander, which is only exclusively found here. So for some species, there is sense of connectivity. So it's because it's able to adapt to these different conditions. But again, certain parts of this differences in physical parameters restricts the movement. It causes fragmentation for certain species to live in that particular area. So that is what connectivity and fragmentation looks at. And this part is very important to understand because connectivity and particularly fragmentation is the one that helps from speciation, because this over time, like if you're talking about different mountain ranges or the fact in an open ocean that splits two continents, that's a bigger scale that we're looking at. This form of fragmentation actually forms speciation over time. Okay, for those who have taken my class on this, I think you'll be able to relate with this better. For others, if you want to know more about speciation, I think you should go and check it out on what speciation is all about. All right, that's it for part 1. I'll move into part 2 of the ecological management concepts, and I will see you right soon.